Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's conversation on SDG 16 with this esteemed panel. Our conversation will be about institutions and the role that strong, effective, transparent, and accountable institutions can play to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The session will run about an hour and 15 minutes. It will include 3 rounds of questions that I'll moderate, audience Q&A, and closing remarks. For the audience Q&A, as Sema mentioned, please type your questions in the chat box as they arise, and we'll cover these in the later part of the agenda. Before I make introductions, I want to share some framing thoughts about our topic. Tomorrow, President Biden will be hosting the inaugural Summit for Democracy, which will be focused on 3 themes: defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. In the midst of a global pandemic, one might wonder why the United States is convening world leaders to address these age-old issues on governance and institutions. However, as our world faces a global health crisis, our institutions are also in crisis. According to the World Justice Project's 2021 Rule of Law Index, 84.7% of the world's population lives in a country where rule of law is deteriorating. Our colleagues at the Chandler Institute of Governance launched the Chandler Good Government Index during the pandemic to measure the capabilities of government, which have been challenged in recent years. With the growing distrust in government, it is critical that we pay attention to the systems and structures that are meant to deliver better outcomes for people. Today, I am honored to have as part of our panel 3 women who have taken on pivotal yet very different roles to strengthen government institutions. Before I introduce our panelists and do a quick self-introduction, I want to thank our hosts, Global Washington, as well as the Pacific Council for co-organizing our panel in partnership with the Chandler Foundation. My name is Leslie Tai, and I am the Director of Social Investment at the Chandler Foundation, where I lead our grant programs. We focus on several aspects of SDG 16, including anti-corruption and strong institutions, which we believe are foundational to achieving our mission of shared prosperity. Our first panelist is Betsy Anderson. She is the director of the World Justice Project and was previously director at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, as well as executive director of the American Society of International Law. Our second panelist is President Laura Chinchilla. President Chinchilla was the first woman to be elected president of Costa Rica. She served in office from 2010 to 2014 and previously served as Minister of Public Security, Congresswoman, Minister of Justice, and Vice President of Costa Rica. Our third panelist is Nancy Lindberg. She is President and CEO of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. She previously served as the President and CEO of the U.S. Institute of Peace and as Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. We are so grateful to have all of you with us today. And to kick off our discussion, I wanted to start by unpacking the meaning of the term strong institutions in SDG 16. I was wondering if you could each share what this goal has meant in the context of your work, as well as how you've seen strong institutions contribute to the broader development agenda. Betsy, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks to you at the Chandler Foundation, to Global Washington, and the Pacific Council for convening us. I'm really privileged to be a part of this conversation. I'm also grateful for your framing this in the context of this idea of strong institutions. What do we mean by strong institutions? It's a phrase that is open to misunderstanding and misuse, and so I think it's really important for us to be very clear about this idea. Institutions that are powerful, that even authoritarian or impervious to outside input, could be characterized as strong. And of course, that's not what we contemplate in Goal 16. So I do think it's an important conversation for us to have and clarify this meaning. It's worth noting, I think, that the SDGs as adopted by the member states do not use this language specifically of strong institutions. peace, justice, and strong institutions is kind of the bumper sticker version of SDG 16 that is used in the infographics and so on, but we lose some important detail in that abbreviated version. So what the member states actually signed up to in Goal 16 was to, quote, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And so I really want to, focus folks on that detail as really reflecting what strength means in this context. We at WJP have been particularly focused on SDG 16.3, which is a subpart of Goal 16, and there the emphasis is on promoting the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensuring equal access to justice for all. And here, again, we've got language that is susceptible to misuse. The words rule of law are bandied about everywhere these days, and often to characterize things that are not really rule of law grounded. They're more rule by law. And so, I think thinking about what does rule of law mean, under this approach, a strong institution does enforce laws and hold people accountable, but it also is accountable itself under the law. The law has to be clear, publicized, stable, and uphold human rights. And the processes by which that law is adopted and administered should be open and accessible. So that's the kind of strength that I think is contemplated in SDG 16 and that we're trying to advocate in our work. Now, what does a strong institution in that meaning of the words bring to the SDGs? Well, strong institutions in this rule of law meaning deliver on the goals, and they also are in a position to do so in a way that is inclusive, that leaves no one behind. So I think that's the critical contribution that this kind of strength brings to this agenda.
Thank you for sharing those nuances about the term strong institutions. I think we can all agree that weak institutions are bad, but when we flip it around and say strong institutions, it does carry some potential misconnotation. So thank you for sharing that, Betsy. Now I'll turn to President Chinchillo, who has asked me to call her Laura. So we'll turn to you, Laura.
Thank you, Leslie. And I certainly will build on what Elizabeth already said. And the first thing I would like to say is that the SDG 16 as defined in the 2030 agenda is both an outcome and enabler for sustainable development. This means, on one hand, that the existence and strengthening of institutions is fundamental in the quest for sustainable development. On the other hand, it means that not all institutions add to that end, but only those that enable the protection of human dignity, human rights, and democratic coexistence. Therefore, the purpose is not to build institutions for the sake of them. On the contrary, we are guided by higher principles and goals to which those institutions are meant to serve. This is why I consider SDG 16 the moral backbone of the 2030 agenda. Firstly, because it recognizes and advances the equal standing of every person in shaping this society they belong. And secondly, because only through effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions will be possible to protect that equal standing, mainly by supporting those that are being left behind. So the adjective is strong, again, as Elizabeth mentioned, could be misunderstood in the context of institution. It is not synonym with concentration of power and arbitrary rule, but on the contrary, it is synonym with inclusion, participation, accountability, and adherence to the rule of law. Around the world, today we are witnessing, unfortunately, an increasing demand on political institutions to adopt more inclusive. No, I mean, this is positive. I mean, civil society is asking for more inclusive, participatory, and accountable decision-making process. And this empowered civic society that we are seeing are demanding the transformation of these institutions. There is, I mean, with this movement, there is a visible growing distrust on traditional democratic institutions, which is a sign that they have lost precisely the enabling character. So we must work towards strengthening them, but we also must be aware that there are no shortcuts towards institution building. Building and transforming effective, inclusive, and accountable institution takes time, sometimes decades, or even centuries. More importantly, there are processes and rules that must be followed. This is why the notion of rule of law is also fundamental when we discuss SDG 16. Sustainable institutions for sustainable development do not depend on the will of one leader or group of people. It depends on the formal arrangements that citizens have agreed upon. The pandemic has represented a big test for decision-making institutions globally to deliver and respond quickly, but also to respect human rights and the rule of law. While some democratically elected governments, including established democracies, have increasingly adopted authoritarian tactics, according to the recently published report on the global state of democracy by International IDEA, the pandemic had a particularly damaging effect on all democratic countries, further closing their already reduced civic space. Moreover, the same report states that authoritarian regimes have not been better than democracies at fighting the pandemic, even without accounting for the lack of transparency in most of non-democracies. On the other side, I would like to mention that many democracies around the world have also proved resilient to the pandemic, introducing or expanding democratic innovations and adapting their practices and institutions in record time. Therefore, and to finish, there is no dichotomy between institutions being effective and institutions being inclusive and accountable. Despite its highly disruptive character, the pandemic has shown that they can all go together and that the voices demanding sacrificing the rule of law in the name of strong leadership are not only dangerous, but also unfounded. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Nancy, if you can share a few thoughts and ideas on this concept of strong institutions as well.
Thank you, Leslie. It's great to be here and wonderful to see Elizabeth and Laura as well. Pleasure to be able to focus on such a critical topic with you all. And it's the perils of going last, because I want to just, first of all, agree strongly with everything that both Laura and Elizabeth have laid out. I was going to make the same point as Elizabeth about the importance of moving from the bumper sticker of strong to the actual language, because of the peril of strong institutions being the benchmark, which we see in so many countries right now, where the strong institution is the military or the police, and that enables them, that enables authoritarian forces to regain or maintain control in ways that are deeply destructive to a more inclusive democracy. So it is that effective, inclusive, accountable language that is so important for the peaceful and just side of the equation. And just the formulation of the goal itself becomes its own theory of change, which I find so powerful, especially after many, many years of working in countries that have fallen apart over and over again, where sustainable goals are not able to be maintained, as Laura mentioned, because they're overturned again and again by conflict. When the system itself is unjust or unequal, you cannot maintain your precious development gains. You almost always plant the seeds for greater conflict, renewed violence, all of the issues that Goal 16 seeks to address. And so I agree with Laura that Goal 16 is indeed the backbone. And the huge difference between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals was the inclusion of Goal 16. And we know that it was a hard-fought, difficult to negotiate addition because it starts getting at what is often seen as the sovereignty of countries. But without it, without that just and inclusive system that is with the institutions as the backbone of that system, you cannot maintain progress. And so for me, it became a powerful reality after spending so many years going into places that were torn apart by war, by conflict, cities were bombed, bullets had flown, families were dispersed. And so it's impossible to underscore how deeply important it is to be thinking about this as part of a development agenda. And that's true whether you're looking at the local level, at the national level, or, and I want to underscore what Laura began talking about at the institutional level. And we're seeing the erosion at every one of those levels of the kind of accountable, inclusive, participatory institutions that really do enable us to make progress. And the pandemic was a perfect example. Climate change is another. If we don't have the kind of institutions that are accountable, that people really feel their voices are heard and enable that kind of joint problem solving, we can't make progress on the kind of global threats that cannot be solved by any one actor. I love that we're doing this the day before the summit, and your introduction, Leslie, I think was perfect in terms of the issues that President Biden will be addressing and underscoring, which, you know, it's basically a Goal 16 summit. I think that it sometimes sounds kind of wonky, and people can't enter into the goal the same way they can clean oceans or, you know, maternal and child health. But it really is the system within which all of us live at a local level and at larger national and international levels.
Thank you, Nancy. In addition to it being the first summit for democracy later this week, I think tomorrow is also Anti-Corruption Day. So a big week for governance issues. And next week as well, the Open Government Partnership Summit, which is also an event to look out for. I want to turn back to Elizabeth or Betsy. I should have asked you this before we started. My daughter's name is Elizabeth and she goes by Lizzie. And I know you as Betsy, but I should ask you, do you prefer Betsy or Elizabeth?
Betsy among friends, so I think that's appropriate here.
Great. Well, thanks, Betsy. I know that you're involved in a number of indices, and I was wondering if you can just speak a little bit to the role that these measurement tools play to enable institutions to deliver better, as you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Great question, and something that's very close to our hearts here at the World Justice Project. We have a saying that if you want to change it, you got to measure it around here. And that's a big part of our work, developing indicators on rule of law and governance to inform policymaking and change efforts. Most notably our rule of law index. And I think one of our colleagues is going to post a link to that in the chat if folks want to learn more about it. And I've also been involved, as you know, Leslie, in the Chandler Good Government Index, which is another great tool in this area. These exercises are really helpful in advancing the global goals, and the goals, the SDG process, of course, recognizes that with having specific indicators and metrics and reporting requirements and processes really at the heart of the whole effort. So how can governments use these tools? Well, in a variety of ways. We see governments using our index, for example. These can be powerful diagnostics for understanding where the gaps are in rule of law, to pinpoint issues or opportunities for reform, for identifying models in other jurisdictions where there's more, a better outcome in these metrics. So that diagnostic use is important. They can also be quite helpful in building political will around these reform efforts and signaling commitment by governments to key stakeholders in these efforts. We've seen governments, a diversity of governments, recently the government of Kosovo, the government of Mexico, government of Philippines, all adopt some of our rule of law index indicators as part of official national development plans to hold themselves accountable, but I think also to signal to stakeholders in government and in civil society and get everybody on board with those efforts. And finally, I think related, these can be really important tools for building trust in institutions. And we've seen globally in the context of the pandemic an erosion in trust in institutions. And I think when governments embrace these kinds of indicators and use them and communicate openly about their performance, that can be trust building in society in ways that are very important. I want to just make two quick points about using data of this nature in advancing the global goals. First, I want to underscore the importance of using people-centered data. All data is not created equal, and I think in this context, an approach that focuses on people-centered data is important. What do I mean by that? Well, in the justice sector, for example, we have a tendency of gathering data from an institutional perspective. We count courts and judges and caseloads and lawyers, all of which is important, but gives us only a partial picture of how justice is working in people's lives. And we have been advocating a complementary source of data, and that is legal needs surveys, surveys of citizens, people in the jurisdiction about the legal problems that they have and how they solve them, to what extent they turn to the justice system, if not, why not, and what impact all of that has in their lives. We've advanced this in the context of the SDGs and been happy to see that the UN has now embraced an indicator, 16.3.3, to encourage states to gather this data about not just how is the justice being delivered by the institutions, but how is it being experienced in people's lives. And it's a really important dimension for us to map a way forward where the reforms will actually have a change-making effect. The second important point about data in this context is to remind folks about the importance of disaggregated data, data that is broken down by demographics, race, gender, religion, geography, age, and so on. And again, with reference to the justice sector, not everyone experiences justice in the same way. And we have a very different rule of law in many jurisdictions based on one's demographic profile. And while the SDG process invites states to report at the national level, it's also, we can lose a lot of the detail about how policies and systems and institutions are performing in individual people's lives when we're only looking at that macro level. So I really want to underscore the importance of using indicators that are disaggregated by demographics and geography.
Thank you. That's a really helpful overview of just the various ways in which these tools can be used to promote change. Nancy, now to you. You have such an impressive resume and have worn many hats throughout your career, from leading Mercy Corps in the NGO sector to serving in the administration at USAID, and now leading one of the US's largest philanthropies. I was wondering if you can share some of the ways in which these various stakeholder groups can strengthen government institutions, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. You know, I think I think the thread through all of those institutions I've been a part of and the work that I've done and seen is the criticality of thinking about these issues in more of a systems approach. There are so many organizations tend to develop deep expertise in a particular issue and delivers it or promotes those solutions in a way that is not cognizant of the system within which it operates. And that, I think, is one of the challenges we have with the SDGs and the way that it is broken up into these 17 goals. When we know that the way that people live, they experience some of these issues and goals in a much more interrelated way. This is a big challenge. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. But I think that whether you're an NGO or a funding institution, looking at the ways to enable the work to be embedded in a larger contextual whole and to really understand what is happening in that particular place where you're operating. And I want to pick up on something that Betsy said, which is the importance of really having that people-centered understanding of the experience. And that can lead you to different solutions and different ways to support what might be the institution at that particular place that can sustain the gain. And I'll just use an example at US Institute of Peace. The corruption in Afghanistan was really undermining the ability of the government to be a trusted actor in local communities. And in fact, the Taliban were often better deliverers of faster, more accountable justice in the eyes of the community. Obviously, this is long before the devastating events of the last year. But so one of the solutions was to create a citizen-based alternative for adjudicating land disputes, which had such huge impact on the people's lives, and connecting that to the legal system in a way that enabled greater credibility of the government and greater confidence by the people in their government. And so I think looking for the kind of solutions that are deeply contextual, that do advance the larger system, can be done at almost every level, whether you're an NGO or a government or a donor, and looking for ways to enable all these different sectors to work together instead of putting up barriers. And I say that from my government experience, where the money is often shooted through very specific ways that actually inhibits greater collaboration. And when I was in office, there was an effort to try to break some of the barriers down, particularly between development actors and humanitarian actors, which when you do that, you lose the opportunity to build greater resilience, even as you respond to disasters. And that includes the resilience of key governmental institutions, whether it's justice or hospitals or, whatever the affected systems are. I think there are so many things that NGOs can do to promote and demand more accountable, inclusive institutions, whether some of the you mentioned, Leslie, tomorrow's anti-corruption focus, some of the innovative ways that civil society has sought to hold their governments accountable is absolutely pivotal for change and transformative in so many ways. And being that demanding that more accountable and more inclusive institution. I want to just end by saying, as somebody who spent most of my career working overseas in the last year, I've been much more focused here in the United States. And what you see in so many indices is the increased fragility of the United States and some of the largest worsening of scores that would talk about the strength of our institutions here in the United States. And so, I think that as we talk about fragility, or as we talk about loss of confidence in core institutions, it's a rising issue that we need to pay very, very close attention to here in the United States.
Thank you, Nancy. I know with a global conference based here in the US, it often sounds like we are preaching to others, but we definitely, excuse me, have a lot to work on and for those of us here in the United States. And thank you for your points on systems change. It's something that we at the Chandler Foundation believe in our core, and it's reassuring to hear that across stakeholder groups, it's something that folks are taking into account and working together collaboratively on. Laura, well, it's such an honor to have a former head of state on this panel. So we very much appreciate your perspectives. And given that much of the audience comes from other stakeholder groups, from NGOs and international institutions, funder groups, we'd love to hear from you. What has been most helpful and also detrimental in helping Costa Rica make progress on the SDGs in terms of external stakeholder group involvement?
Well, thank you, Leslie. I will say that it has been more helpful rather than detrimental to have had the support of international organizations and NGOs. And probably I should explain a little more about my country, but in general, I think it's the same situation with most of the small developing countries. International law and the multilateral system have always been my country's, Costa Rica's, main tools to protect its sovereignty and advance our agenda on human rights and democracy. We are a very small country located in one of the most violent regions in the world. Despite all this, our country decided to abolish the armed forces more than 70 years ago, allowing us to invest on human development instead of investing on military gear. But most importantly, concerning this discussion we are having, we took that decision, among other reasons, because we know that international law was there to protect us and promote essential values for our society. Let me give you just a couple of examples. First, during my government, the dictatorship that governs Nicaragua invaded a portion of our territory and caused environmental damage. Costa Rica, instead of responding with military force, because we simply don't have it, we brought the case to the International Court of Justice. With the evidence provided, the court ruled in our favor. The ruling allowed us to restore our sovereignty in the invaded lands and we also received compensation for the environmental damage that was caused. The second example is more recent, and that was 4 years ago. The country was not making any progress in the discussion of the rights of same-sex couples due to the political deadlock coming from some groups. So a query was filed before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which issued an opinion stating the right of same-sex couples to marry. The courts of our country immediately adopted this criterion as part of our legal order, and that is how an important step was taken in the field of human rights. But we are full of these kind of examples. However, for these kind of small nations like Costa Rica, the current state of multilateralism is very worrisome. The COVID-19 pandemic occurred in a context marked by the return of nativism, autarky, protectionism, treaty withdrawals, and a worrisome emphasis on military and economic coercion from some great powers, jeopardizing multilateral and global governance. I think that the ongoing pandemic is both a defining moment that may considerably weaken the legacy of 75 years of nations working together to resolve problems, but also an opportunity to make some those same institutions and framework most effective. And there is a very interesting debate going on about the future of the multilateral system and those institutions based on rules. Consequently, I think that we must try to bring those discussions beyond the box and consider how to repurpose our global institutions toward new ends. In doing so, it is necessary to build more inclusive and dynamic multi-stakeholder approaches. I totally share the approach of people-centered for any kind of a strategy, even for reforming the international system. In fact, we can get inspiration from recent experiences, such as the initiatives against global warming, mostly heralded by young people, and those on gender equality led by women in many countries around the world. So we must critically review our international organizations and push for ambitious reform that can lead to more democratic structures, to strengthen its effectiveness, and to enhance to the capacity to meet current challenges and continue supporting those small developing nations that will need it as never before. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And that's a good transition into discussing some of the unique challenges that have been brought about during the pandemic over the past few years. And I want to ask each of you a question on this topic related to your work. Betsy, your area of focus has been on the rule of law, which has faced significant challenges and erosion during the pandemic. What are some urgent calls to action that can get us back on track?
No, thanks, Leslie. You're absolutely right. This period has seen a marked deterioration in the rule of law. We recently published our 2021 Rule of Law Index, and it was the first of this series that was published since the declaration of the pandemic. So we between the two editions of the index, we can see a very clear indication of the dynamics in rule of law during the pandemic period. As you mentioned at the outset, 84% of the world's population, according to this metric, lives in a jurisdiction that saw the rule of law decline during this pandemic period. 74% of countries that we studied saw a decline in this period. There were 4 areas substantively in our index that kind of emerged as the areas of most marked decline during this period. First was constraints on government powers. All the checks and balances that we like to see in a strong rule of law environment have eroded. Second, and related, we saw a continuing and marked shrinking of civic space, civic participation, assembly, association, all curtailed during this period. Third, a really striking decline in the timeliness of justice. 94% of the countries studied in our index saw an increase in the length of time of justice proceedings in criminal, civil, and administrative justice. And finally, a pretty striking and marked increase in discrimination in our indicators during this period. So each of these requires a different kind of response, and we could probably have 4 panels on each of them. So I'll just offer a few suggestions. One overarching observation, though, is that I think we need to be mindful that while some of these problems are quite clearly related to the pandemic, the increase in delays in justice is a function of the fact that courts were closed for a period of time and so on. And some of that, and we can bounce back pretty quickly when we open courts. But others of these really, while they accelerated during the pandemic, the problems really predate the pandemic. These are trends that we have seen in our data for at least 4 years, and some of them are very long-standing problems that the pandemic has really revealed or exacerbated, but we need to recognize the difference there. a couple of ideas for urgent action. One is, I think it's really important that we insist on rolling back of the emergency powers that governments have asserted and exercised during this period. The increased measures of surveillance, limitations on assembly and association, all of that. Some of it may have been justified in the context of the health emergency, but that justification recedes, and we need to insist that these measures are sunsetted and reverted to pre-pandemic conditions. Related, I think, to that effort, it's important that we have an educated citizenry that can advocate for that and hold governments accountable. And here, it's really coming back to our initial discussion about what do strong institutions mean and the difference between rule of law and rule by law. It's really important for citizens to understand that difference and to insist on rule of law and not be accepting of rule by law. So I think a global focus on civic education and educating people about their rights is really important. Third, this has, of course, been a period of technological innovation, and I think that's maybe a little silver lining in all of this story, and an opportunity for us to harness technology to introduce openness, accountability, and accessibility in governance and justice. This, of course, has to be done in a way that is people-centered, data-driven, accessible. We need to be mindful of the digital divide and make sure that embracing technology leaves no one behind. But I think there are really important opportunities to be seized there. And finally, I want to pick up on something that Nancy mentioned about the rule of law developments in the United States. And I do think that there is an urgent need for focus there, that the US government, of course, is convening the Democracy Summit now to focus on these issues, but I think it's as important that that focus be domestic as it is international. One of the innovations of the SDGs is, of course, the notion that this is a universal agenda, that it applies everywhere. And I think there's more to be done for that to be recognized in the US and to be embraced. And one very specific concrete to do in that context, the US is the only country in the OECD and the only country in the G20 that has not filed a voluntary national report about its own performance on the SDGs. I think that's shocking and shameful. There have been 250 voluntary national reports filed in the SDG process. It's overdue for the US to do that, and that would be an important signal and step forward on this agenda.
Thank you, Betsy, for putting that spotlight on the rule of law, which is clearly facing a crisis right now, and lots to be done. Nancy, now to you. So in today's conversation, we've been focusing a lot on strong institutions, but another key aspect of SDG 16 is peace. And I know this peace and security is a big part of your background. During the pandemic, we've seen a number of states become unstable and conflict affected. As you mentioned, the tragedy of Afghanistan, but also Sudan, Myanmar, and elsewhere. How do we make progress in these countries when the world is preoccupied with its own health and economic recovery?
Yeah, well, that's a sobering and deeply challenging question, Leslie. And I think the pandemic has diverted attention, but as Betsy said, I think the roots of those problems and the difficulties of addressing them effectively far predate the pandemic. I would make a couple of key comments. It's interesting. First of all, every conflict is its own very specific contextual analysis. So I'm mindful that I'm making a few generalities here. But I think those three examples, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Sudan, really underscore the importance of where we started with the words of accountable and inclusive and effective institutions, because Afghanistan was never able to develop institutions that delivered for the people of Afghanistan. Corruption undermined them. They were ineffective. They were not able to create credibility and a sense of confidence. Myanmar and Sudan both have strong military and police that the military never relinquished control over. And in the case of Myanmar, I think there's been a lot of commentary that during that democratic interlude with Aung San Suu Kyi, she really was not successful in bringing forward the kind of institutions that were a counterbalance. A lot of complexities and obviously she had a lot of challenges, but you know, they never really were able to get the economy fully roaring, and they started chipping away at journalistic freedom and all kinds of ways in which institutions were handcuffed and constrained. And then, of course, in Sudan, it was such a new effort that even as progress was being made, that made the military more nervous and they overtook it. So in all instances, you have the challenge of then what do you do? And this really goes to Laura's very important discussion on rule of law as an international framework. And we have seen, particularly in the instance of Sudan and Myanmar, that there are no levers to pull in the absence of an international system that prioritizes some of the core concepts versus the sovereignty that always becomes paramount in these kinds of conversations. And it's the limits that we have within, whether it's the Security Council or some of the regional groupings like ASEAN or IGAD in Africa. And so it's one is how can we shore up in regional and international institutions that really prioritize rule of law and give levers for outside actors to have influence when you've got these kinds of coups. My second point is that the US, like it or not, is a critical player in many of these systems in upholding some of the values that are so core to maintaining peace and stability. And we are a weakened actor. We have less and less credibility for a lot of reasons that you could spend a long time talking about. And so we are less able to play a role. And there have not been the kind of strong actor who's been able to come in to really insist on upholding that. And I say that knowing that it's always a mixed bag. There are many things that the US has done that has undermined at the same time. And Afghanistan is a prime example where, and this leads me to my third point, which is the Global Fragility Act was passed by US Congress in December 2019, which really sought to create more harmonized understanding between the US capabilities of development, diplomacy, and defense, so that we didn't undermine in the service of multiple goals. So in Afghanistan, even as we were trying to build a stronger state, more effective and accountable state, our military and our intelligence efforts were fighting the Taliban and fighting ISIS, respectively, in ways that undermined the ability of the state to be stood up, because it brought corruption, supported corruption, and non-state actors like some of the warlords and militias. So we as a US actor need to do a better job, which is what the Global Fragility Act is attempting to do, of really walking our own talk in bringing all of our capabilities together to support development in a way that creates a stronger democracy, a more inclusive and accountable governance system that is essential for maintaining peace in a country. And I'll go back to one of my earlier comments that when you have deeply unjust and unequal systems, you have the seeds for future conflict and violence. And that's what we see over and over again throughout the world. And when democracies do not deliver for their citizens, which has been a key part of the democratic decline over the past 15 years, when citizens don't have the space to act or they're deluged with mis and disinformation, that's when you see the rise of authoritarianism. And so I would support Betsy's list of some of the urgent action. And we are at a really important moment. I believe from years of working in crises that moments of crises do provide those moments for transformation. And I think Laura said something similar, but we really do need to understand the urgency of the situation, and all of us look at ways that we can contribute to turning this moment around.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Nancy. I love the last statement you made about moments of crises providing moments for transformation. Laura, now to you. You have been a champion of women's rights and the protection of children, and unfortunately, this has been another area that has been under threat during the pandemic. This has been a time when violence against women and children have increased at alarming rates. When we talk about building back better for the entire global population, how do we make sure that we do so inclusively to include groups like women and children in this discussion?
Thank you very much for that question, Leslie. We have to recognize that one of the most devastating effects of the crisis triggered by COVID-19 pandemic is that it exacerbated domestic violence, affected children and women out of any proportion. That was also the case of Latin America, my region, in an investigation in which I participated because there still not much information about the dimensions of the problem. But in this investigation that was in mid-2020, we found that during the first months of the pandemic, when the most restrictive sanitary measures were adopted, such as lockdowns and confinement, in Rio de Janeiro, for example, in Brazil, the Court of Justice for Domestic Violence reported an increase of 50% of complaints of gender violence. And in Mexico, the National Institute of Women registered a 60% increase in requests for help from victims of violence. In addition to the problem itself, the institutional response to domestic violence was weakened. On the one hand, the confinement of victims in homes made reporting extremely difficult, and the supporting networks like family, friends, etc., were interrupted, all of which increased the number of unreported cases. That is why it's being very difficult to measure the dimension of the problem. On the other hand, the overload of public services such as health and police, and the temporary closure of others such as the justice system, limited the attention of the victims of domestic violence in a wide array of programs like emergency responses, operation of shelters, or the execution, for example, of protection orders. So what women have suffered during these times of crisis highlights three underlying conditions in my criteria. The first is the structural nature of violence against women. This is a problem that has affected them regardless of their age, social status, nationality, or ethnicity. The figures were actually already alarming before the pandemic hit us. According to the United Nations, in 2019, only 1 in 3 girls and women globally experience physically or sexual violence, mostly by an intimate partner. Second, gender inequality in general makes women more vulnerable to any kind of crisis, further widening the gender gap. In Latin America, and excuse me because I have the figures of my region, it is estimated that the pandemic set back women's inclusion in the labor market by at least 10 years, since it amplified the unfair gender division of labor and the social organization of care. And third, the invisibility of women during crisis and the limited reaction of governments, or the total absence of responses. According to UN Women data, during the pandemic, only 19% of the countries analyzed in a report adopted gender-sensitive measures in the most critical areas, such as violence against women, women economic security, and support unpaid care. In 50% of the countries, there were no gender-sensitive measures at all. So given the top lessons that we learned during the current crisis, I am convinced that governments must reevaluate their policy priorities in their recovery and development strategies. The policy priority, according to my criteria ahead, should be, and we can repeat it as a mantra, to reduce gaps, and to reduce gaps. The closing of gaps, especially the gender gap, must be placed at the core of any strategy. It is very urgent to implement policies right now, not only with the aim of stopping the gender gaps from widening, as it is happening, but also with the clear goal of closing them for good. Finally, some comments on some policy priorities that I envision. First, I think that nations should ensure that universal social protection programs are going to be in place and further strengthened, as they have been proving to positively impact health, social, and economic outcomes. Secondly, to reduce economic and political gender gaps by enacting regulations, but also something very important, promoting attitudes. An analysis that I participated as part of the Human Development Report in 2019, it was very clear that social norms are playing probably the most important role in terms of blocking the advances of women equality. And finally, we must bring more youth and women into the processes of law and policy making. Their vulnerability does not only result from the lack of laws or policy addressing their issues, but also, and if not mainly, from the lack of their participation in those processes. So we must empower them and try to give them the voice that they don't have right now in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that urgent call to action, especially to close gaps. There are so many widening inequalities, especially in gender, but also across various areas that have been exacerbated. Well, now we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I see a few questions have already come in through the Whova app, and encourage other audience members to enter your questions. The first one is about this point of SDG 16 being the moral backbone of all of the SDGs. Yet SDG 16 seems to get relatively little attention in the global development community. Why and what can NGOs, funders, governments, and other stakeholders do to elevate and amplify SDG 16?
I'm happy to give a start at that. I think that it's harder for people to put their arms around for a couple of reasons. One is it is more of a systems approach rather than something that is deliverable or touchable or tangible in somebody's life. Secondly, I think so many people experience their systems, their governments, their institutions as being problematic, not delivering something they polarize with, that they haven't had a good experience with. So there are, for many people, there is not a positive, affirmative example that they're reaching towards or that they understand. And third, I think that we aren't, especially in the development world, we aren't set up to work in interconnected systems. Our institutions are all deeply stovepiped, and we have deep verticals of expertise that keeps us from seeing how what we're doing needs to be within this larger system. And so I want to go back to the Global Fragility Act that I mentioned that passed in 2019. That is an effort to put a Goal 16 approach at the heart of development. And it hasn't been fully realized. The pandemic intervened. So many crises within the United States, I think, has obscured some of the energy and motivation that really pushed that forward by so many NGOs in the development space who said, hey, we've got to think differently about how we do development. The word Goal 16 doesn't appear, but the spirit of it very much infuses that Global Fragility Act, which I hope will still gain the kind of traction that it needs an uptake by the Biden administration. World Bank had a similar new policy. DFID was working on a similar policy. So I think there is a recognition within a lot of development circles. They don't always call it Goal 16. And I think that there's an opportunity to make that connection stronger and to lift up all of the SDGs in a more interconnected way and with greater urgency as we approach 2030. I do think the pandemic has pushed people's awareness into different places, and it's a good moment to bring it back up through fora like these, Leslie.
Leslie, can I jump in?
Absolutely.
So great question. And I couldn't agree more with Nancy in her response there, just to really add a couple of additional thoughts that are complementary. One is I think that there is a great opportunity to do research that connects the dots between rule of law and SDG 16 issues and the other goals and the other things that are more tangible, as Nancy mentioned. We have been working and developing some efforts to use our data on rule of law to understand and evaluate and quantify the relationship between good government and governance and other outcomes, health outcomes, education outcomes, environmental outcomes, to make a quantifiable case for the difference that governance makes. If we can see that there is positive correlation between strong rule of law and better public health, for example, and exactly what dimensions of rule of law are most important for those outcomes. So I think that's an important effort. And as well, I think there's need for not just that quantifiable or quantitative analysis, but also qualitative analysis, the storytelling that makes this understandable for people, why investments in justice make a difference for health, for example. It's not obvious and intuitive, but I think there's a very good story to tell there, and we need to tell that. And finally, I couldn't agree more with Nancy on the stovetyping of development assistance. And I think there's a challenge for donors to think about developing projects that are intentionally integrated, that invite implementers to think through the systems dimension of assistance delivery and to develop integrated approaches. It's hard, but it's essential for this work to really be sustainable and effective.
Leslie, I would like to add something else. I would like to underline the importance of moving away from some kind of formalistic approaches. At least that has been the experience in Latin America. I have worked also with some international organizations trying to international cooperation. And usually we understand the improving of the rule of law, of democracy, as changing the laws, approving a new law, for creating a new institution. At this point, I will say that the most critical issue is to invest in culture, in civic values. We have to be able to work with the people. When you analyze some of the polls in some developing nations, but even in some developed nations, there is a deterioration of some of those values. So, for example, concerning the role of social media in influence people's attitude, I will say that it is not only about digital literacy, it has to do with literacy concerning how we debate, how tolerant we are going to be, and understanding the importance of those underlying values of democracy. And finally, I would also like to say something about the financial, international, and regional institutions, because they must also include those issues we are discussing today as part of their priorities. Unfortunately, they are not doing that. They are ignoring. They are only concerned about the rule of law that creates the good condition for investment, but they are not concerned about human rights. So I think it is the time to put the financial institutions working together with the multilateral institutions and try to come up with a kind of different also approach.
Thank you for all three of those very helpful responses, and just a lot of great ideas that hopefully this multi-stakeholder group in the audience can also take home to reflect on. One of the questions comes from somebody who works on domestic and sexual violence issues. And the question is how individuals can reconcile working on these issues that are oftentimes controversial and restrictive in their own home governments, while working in this broader government structure. So I think it goes to your earlier point, Laura, about this crisis that women and children are facing, yet they work in these restrictive, authoritarian, or oppressive governance environments. So how do you address one while working in an environment where institutions are not promoting of these types of calls to action? I think it's a very challenging question, and I think goes to this kind of circular concept of where we need to have better institutions so that we can work on these important causes.
Well, Leslie, I think that it is not only about institutions, it is not only about civic values and the people, it is also about the kind of leadership. And right now there is, we are in a kind of vicious cycle in which the people are trying to get, the responses to their problems, but they think that those responses are coming with those strong and populist leaders. So if we continue, doing that, the situation, especially for women, will be terrible. I always say that if there is a feminist cause, it is fighting for democracy, because it is in democracies where women have more rights and more empowerment. So here, it is hard to say where to start, but we have to understand that this is a little complex because it's a vicious cycle where people are demanding more, better institutions, or stronger institutions in a kind of misunderstanding, and then they associate those institutions with a strong kind of leaders. We can continue doing that.
So we have a couple more questions, but only 6 minutes to go. But I think this last question is a good note to end on. So maybe if you can each provide a quick 1-minute response to this question from Peter Blomquist, which is, in context of these challenging times in terms of peace, justice, and strong institutions, what gives you hope?
I'll start. I have a quick answer, and that is youth. I like to think about the generation that's coming of age now during the pandemic, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement as Gen J for justice. And I think they feel an urgency, and they see a path forward, and they are leading. And I think there's a lot of hope there, an opportunity for us to invest in that effort.
Yeah, you know, when I spent many years going to humanitarian response efforts and disaster zones, people would ask me that question. And I think my answer is the same now as it was then. And that is, you know, it's sometimes when things get the worst that the best in people come out. You know, people really lean in, whether it's youth or women or, you know, every person in a community. I do think that's when our best selves come forward and we come up with strengths and visions and actions that we maybe didn't even know we had within us. And I used to see that in the most terrible moments. And I believe that we're starting to see that now, where people are coming forward and just rejecting some of the more oppressive, unequal efforts and rethinking. You know, I really liked Laura's earlier comment about policies really need to reduce gaps. You know, it's the inequalities in our policies that have really been terrible, that have just been blind, or many people have been blinded to. So it's the resilience, it's the strengths, it's the energy of the action that almost always results.
Okay, I will only underline some of the comments already made by my colleagues in the panel. And one is that it gives me hope, the young people, you know, trying to achieve what they want to, even when they go out to the streets. I think that they are realizing that there is political life between one and other election. And they want to exercise their political rights every day. So that is why we have to be innovative in reforming our institutions to open more participation to the people. And secondly, that when you analyze in some regions, female leaders are gaining more relevance. I mean, they are having more positions, mostly in Congress. And I think that also this is a time when we need more kind of female leadership in many nations.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists who've offered diverse and insightful perspectives on this topic of strong institutions, as well as to our engaged audience for your insightful questions. I just wanted to do a quick recap of some of the themes that arose from today's conversation. And one, as we started off in the Q&A on this moral backbone, SDG 16 as the moral backbone of the 2030 agenda. And how, you know, it might be helpful to reframe this term strong institutions as effective, transparent, and accountable institutions that are inclusive. There are some great points made about the importance of the system and systems approaches to tackling problems, about people-centered experiences and approaches, as well as some, you know, calling out of the great powers in this ecosystem, including the United States, multilateral institutions, and the roles that they can play to solving some of these great social challenges of our time. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that I hope that we will all take these ideas back with us and explore how we in our own work in social change can both accelerate and be accelerated by better institutions. I wanted to thank everyone once again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you.